Hello and welcome to the beginner painting course Lite. I'm Taylor Payton and I'm going to be walking you through these 4 simple lessons on digital painting and some of its fundamentals and techniques that can really catapult you and give you a strong foundation to work with. So first and foremost, we'll kind of address, what is painting? And painting is essentially using brushstrokes and marks to create shapes and forms in accordance with light sources. So I'll say that one more time. Painting is using brushstrokes and marks to create shapes and forms in accordance with light sources. And what this basically means is that you're going to be creating these marks, whether they're more circular in nature like the default round brush in Photoshop, or generating other shapes that you're familiar with and rendering them in accordance with light sources. So that just means that as we're creating these very simple shapes to start with, we want to use tones or values, which basically is our brightness slider here, starting at 0 and ending at 100. We can simplify that from a 0 to 10 scale. And we're using different ranges of values to create lights and shadows on shapes that make them appear dimensional. But we're doing that by using brushstrokes. Like right now I'm kind of just going up and down this form right here. And if I were to render on the circular form with a darker value, just kind of following the form around and creating shading. When I'm pulling the value, I'm just using the Alt key, and then I'm laying down a couple brush strokes. Then I'll Alt somewhere else, lay down a couple more strokes. In this case, I'm going to go over to the color menu and just bump it up a little bit so that I know that the value that comes out in the digital paint is going to be higher than the value that I color picked, or in this case, value picked. So you always want to be aware of your values first and foremost. Darker values tend to get us in our shadow areas, and lighter values tend to move us toward, painting light or doing our best to paint how we perceive light. So we always have to keep our lights and shadows separate because that's what gives us the illusion of form and depth. Like, for example, if we were to start another shape here, let's say a cube, because it's very faceted. It has 6 faces, 6 sides. And I'll start by making this first side a very dark value. This is just one plane of the cube, one face. More on surface planes later. And then the next side of the cube, since this is a 1.6 in terms of our value scale, I'm going to knock it up to about a 4.6. Doesn't have to be that precise, however. So this face of the cube is receiving more light, and thus it has a higher value and separates it from this part. If we want, we can bevel the cube and have a value that's in between the two, whereas this is that very dark 1.6. This is a 30 or a 3.0. And this is our 4.7. So this edge appears to turn here and turns even more so here, whereas this one is being affected the most by light. If we take that 4.7, knock it up to about 5.7, and paint the top plane of our cube here, then we can see that that's receiving the most light because its value is the highest. So the higher the value, the more in accordance with light it is, or being affected by a light source. Shadow is the lack of light in an area, which means that an object is either interfering with the light reaching it, like a really sharp turn, like this 90-degree turn here, or there is a shadow that's being cast on the object and lowering its value. So for example, if I were to paint a cylinder right about here. I'm gonna give myself a little more room on the canvas to do that though. I'm gonna paint a cylinder next to the cube. Just pop this guy in over here. I'm gonna start by drawing the caps of the cylinder, which are elliptical in nature. I'm just going to rough in the cylinder. I'm not really minding the values too much at this point. I just want that solid cylindrical shape. Obviously this is going to be the highest value up at the top cap. Then we have to turn the form. So I have to get rid of that dark value on the bottom elliptical cap. Gotta keep carving at this ellipse in order to create the proper perspective illusion. So you see I'm just making these shapes and sculpting them as though they were clay with values. So we have the cylinder here, the top being a 6 basically, which is the same as the top of our cube. And then this part of the cylinder would be in shadow, but it's going to be a much more gradual transition because the cylindrical form is much more smooth in resolution. It's not as faceted as the cube, so this is a very hard surface and thus a harsh value transition, whereas this is a softer surface, meaning that the brush strokes are going to soften, the transition is going to be smoother between light and shadow. Different materials have different value patterns, and those are patterns that you'll have to memorize by studying those materials and how they react in light. I'm just painting very matte clay-like shapes because it's the most foundational material you can kind of learn. And we'll talk a little more about materials in the beginner painting course Lite here, but that will probably be in the last chapter, chapter 4, where we will repaint one of my old paintings and show you how you can go from beginner to more intermediate as a painter. Anyway, let's talk about cast shadows and we'll wrap this first lesson up. So cast shadows are like form shadows, which are the shadows that innately fall on the forms of any given object, in that they're in the shadow family. However, the cast shadow is because one object's presence is blocking light from reaching another object. And to create believable scenes, that's something we're going to have to deal with. So in this case, we're painting in the white void, and I would only do this for demonstration purposes because this is literally the highest value we can use on the canvas, so we're maxed out. If I kind of go to the background layer and turn this closer to like 70 range, then you can see that we have a lot more of a relaxed value scale. It's easier on the eyes. And if this is my ambient sort of background value, then I'm going to need to have it lower than this to have a cast shadow or to bring something into the shadow family. So if I knock it down, let's say by about 2 values, by a full value step, then I can begin to cast a shadow using this cylinder as my reference. So I cast a shadow on the ground plane, which didn't really exist until the shadow was there. We had a bit of the illusion based on the positioning of these two objects, but it wasn't as notable that they weren't floating like these guys. So we're casting a shadow across the ground plane because it's darker than the ambient value around everything else, but this value is also darker. In fact, it's even darker than the shadow on the ground plane. So if I were to use this right here, it actually looks like it's casting light. And that's gross. That's not what we want. We want to keep our value scale tight. So it's got to be in the shadow family because it's casting a shadow onto the cube. Well, what value should we start with? We should start with the one that's in the light, because that value gives us the proper number that we're going to be basing it off of. So if we go from 77 to about 60, so let's say 8 to 6, then this is 4.5. So simple math says go down to about 2.5, and then finish casting your shadow. Pretty cool, huh? So that's how you can start to work in your forms and give consideration to your light source, which in this case was off up here, because the brightest value was up here and the shadow value is right here, and the second brightest value is right there. So if I want to get some shadow on this one, I got to drop it another, basically down to 9. And so now we're casting it on the beveled edge as well. And then we could even occlude so that there's almost no light underneath the cube. Very dark. And since we're going to make it very dark, we have to be a little more subtle about that. It's a really harsh value transition, so we want to use it very small, make very small brush strokes and shapes around that. And then I can do that around the whole bottom edge of the cube to give an even greater illusion of what's going on as far as a light source goes. Yeah, it's all about learning where to place your shadows, what to keep in the shadow family, what to keep in the light family, and eventually you'll be able to render things out and paint dimensionally, and that's a really fun thing. Now, this has been the lesson 1 of the beginner painting course Lite. Feel free to check out the full beginner painting course that talks about more of these principles and then some in the description box below. Otherwise, look out for the next couple lessons leading up to lesson 4, maybe at the end of this video, or if they haven't been released yet, then please subscribe, like, and share, and encourage more activity on the channel. I really appreciate all of your help and all of your support, and I will see you in the next lesson. Take care and happy painting.